Marcus Chun stood at the window of the transport ship and watched the alien planet grow larger and larger before his eyes. He had been a soldier for 15 years, and he had fought in more battles than he could count, but nothing had prepared him. For this moment, the Galactic Council had made its decision, and there was no way to change it. Humanity needed this alliance to survive, and Marcus was the price they had to pay. The Celestin Dominion was the most powerful empire in 3 galaxies, and their Empress Zaravan ruled over 1,000 worlds with absolute power. She was beautiful in a way that made humans feel small, and she was ancient beyond human understanding. When the council told Marcus that he would marry her, he had laughed. At first because he thought it was a joke, but no one else was laughing. "You are the best we have," the council president had told him with a serious face. "You are brave, and you are patient, and you know how to survive in difficult situations." Marcus had wanted to refuse, but then he thought about his home planet and the billions of people who lived there. If this marriage did not happen, then humanity would be left alone in a galaxy full of enemies. So he said yes, and he packed his few belongings, and he boarded the ship that would take him to his new life. Now, as the ship descended through the clouds of the Celestin homeworld, Marcus felt his heart beat faster. The planet was beautiful, with purple skies and silver oceans and cities that floated in the air like dreams made solid. But Marcus knew that beauty could hide terrible things. The ship landed on a platform made of crystal, and Marcus stepped out into the alien air. It smelled like flowers he had never seen, and the light from the twin suns made everything glow with a soft golden color. He expected someone important to meet him, but instead he found only a single servant waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The servant was tall and thin, with blue skin and large, dark eyes that looked at Marcus with barely hidden disgust. "You are the human," the servant said in a flat voice. "I am Commander Marcus Chun." Marcus replied with a polite nod. The servant did not introduce himself, and he did not bow or show any sign of respect. "Follow me," was all he said before turning and walking away. Marcus picked up his bag and followed the servant through the floating city. People stopped and stared at him as he passed, and Marcus heard them whispering to each other in their musical language. He did not understand most of what they said, but he caught a few words that he recognized: primitive and animal and waste of time. Marcus kept his face calm and his back straight as he walked, had faced enemy fire without flinching, and he would not let whispers break his spirit. The servant led him to a palace that rose into the sky like a mountain of glass, and light inside the halls was so large that Marcus felt like an ant crawling through a cathedral. Everything was designed to make visitors feel small and unimportant. After walking for what felt like an hour, they arrived at a great door covered in symbols that glowed with inner fire. "The Empress will see you now," the servant said, and then he walked away without another word. Marcus took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Throne room was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. Pillars of pure light held up a ceiling that showed the stars themselves. Moving in their eternal dance, nobles in flowing robes stood in groups along the walls, and they all turned to look at Marcus as he entered. And there at the far end of the room, sitting on a throne made of frozen starlight, was Empress Zaravan. She was more beautiful than any picture could capture, with silver hair that floated around her head like a halo, and eyes that burned with the cold fire of distant suns. Her skin was pale lavender, and her features were sharp and perfect like a sculpture carved by a master artist. Marcus walked toward her with steady steps, and when he reached the proper distance, he stopped and bowed low. He stayed in that position and waited for her to speak. The silence stretched on and on. Finally, he heard the soft sound of her footsteps as she rose from her throne and walked toward him. She circled around him slowly, and Marcus could feel her eyes examining every part of him. "So this is what humanity offers," she said, and her voice was like ice and honey mixed together. "A soldier from a species that still measures its existence in mere centuries." She stopped in front of him and tilted her head To one side, you may rise, she said. Marcus straightened up and looked at her face for the first time. There was no warmth in her eyes and no welcome on her lips. I expected something more impressive. She continued in a bored tone, but I suppose one cannot expect much from such a young and primitive species. Marcus said nothing because he knew that anything he said would only make things worse. The Empress raised one perfect eyebrow. He does not even defend himself, she announced to the watching nobles. Perhaps the reports are true, and humans really are as spineless as worms. Laughter echoed through the throne room. Marcus felt his face grow hot, but he kept his expression neutral. I am here to serve the alliance between our peoples, he said in a calm and respectful voice. Whatever form that service takes. The Empress smiled, but it was not a kind smile. How wonderfully obedient, she said, like a trained pet. More laughter from the nobles. Take him to his quarters, the Empress commanded with a wave of her hand. The old wing should be sufficient for someone of his status. A guard appeared at Marcus's side and gestured for him to follow. As Marcus turned to leave, the Empress spoke one more time. Human, she called out. Marcus stopped and looked back at her. Do not expect things to be easy for you here, she said with a cold smile. You are nothing but a symbol of a treaty I was forced to accept, and I will treat you accordingly. Marcus bowed his head slightly. I understand, Your Majesty, he said. Then he followed the guard out of the throne room. Old wing of the palace was cold and dark and far away from everywhere important. The room they gave Marcus was small, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out at nothing but gray walls. It was clearly a room meant for servants, not for someone who would be married to the Empress. Marcus set his bag on the bed and sat down heavily. Thought about his home and his friends and the life he had left behind. He wondered if he had made a terrible mistake, but then he remembered the faces of the children on Earth who would grow up in a galaxy where humanity had allies instead of only enemies. He remembered why he had said yes. Marcus stood up and walked to the window. The twin suns were setting, and the sky was turning from gold to deep purple. Patience, he said quietly to himself. Patience is its own kind of strength. He did not know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not give up, and he would not break no matter what the Empress or anyone else did to him. It was Marcus Chun, and he was a survivor, and survivors always find a way. The wedding day arrived, and Marcus stood alone in his cold room getting dressed in the ceremonial clothes. They had given him. The clothes were beautiful with silver thread woven through dark blue fabric, but Marcus noticed that the style was outdated by at least 100 years. It was another small insult in a long line of small insults. He looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. Today, he would marry an empress who hated him in front of billions of beings across 17 star systems. The ceremony was being broadcast everywhere because the Empress had demanded it. Marcus understood why. She wanted the galaxy to see how little she thought of her human groom. A servant came to bring him to the great hall, and Marcus followed. Without speaking, the hall was filled with thousands of guests from every corner of the empire and beyond. Dignitaries and nobles and ambassadors had come to witness this historic event. Marcus walked down the long aisle toward the altar, and he could feel every eye upon him. Whispers followed him like shadows, so small. Someone said, "Look at how he walks." Another laughed, like a child pretending to be important. Marcus kept his eyes forward and his steps steady, reached the altar and took his position, and then he waited and waited and waited some more. 1 hour passed, and then another. The guests began to shift and murmur with confusion. Where was the Empress finally? After nearly 2 hours, a trumpet sounded, and the great doors opened. Empress Zaravan entered the hall, and the crowd gasped. She was wearing black, not the white and gold of celebration, but the deep black of mourning. It was a message that everyone understood. This marriage was a death to her, and she wanted the entire galaxy to know it. Marcus felt the humiliation wash over him like a wave of cold water, but he did not let it show on his face. The Empress walked slowly down the aisle with her head held high and a look of boredom on her beautiful face. When she reached the altar, she stood as far from Marcus as possible. The ceremony began, and the ancient words were spoken. When it came time for the Empress to say Marcus's name, she paused. "I take this human," she said with a small smirk. "Marcus Chain is my consort." She had mispronounced his name on purpose, and titters of laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus said his vows perfectly and clearly, and when he spoke the Empress's name, he pronounced every syllable with proper respect. The ceremony ended, and they were declared married. But there was no kiss and no embrace, and no sign that this was anything other than a legal requirement at the reception. Marcus discovered that his seat was not at the high table with the Empress. Instead, he had been placed at a small table in the corner near the servants, sat down without complaint, and ate his food in silence. Guests walked past him without acknowledging his existence. Some pointed and laughed, others simply looked through him as if he were invisible. The Empress entertained her guests with stories and jokes, and Marcus could hear her voice carrying across the hall. "They say humans have a lifespan of less than 100 years," she announced with mock sympathy. "Can you imagine being gone so quickly? What will you do with him, Your Majesty?" Someone asked. "I am told humans make adequate pets." The Empress replied with a cruel smile. "Perhaps I will train him to fetch things." The laughter that followed was loud and long. Marcus finished his meal and quietly left the reception. No one noticed him go. Months that followed were a continuous test of his patience and his will. The Empress gave him quarters in the oldest and coldest part of the palace, where the heating systems barely worked and the walls were damp with moisture. She assigned him duties that were meant for the lowest servants: cleaned floors and carried messages and organized storage rooms, while everyone watched and whispered at state dinners. He was seated so far from the Empress that he could barely see her. She would tell stories about human primitiveness to entertain her guests. "Did you know," she would say with wide eyes, "that humans cannot even survive in space without special suits wrapping their fragile bodies? How do they manage anything?" A noble would reply with exaggerated concern. "I have no idea," the Empress would laugh. "It is a miracle they learned to walk upright." Marcus sat through these dinners with a calm expression and ate his food without responding. The Empress took lovers openly and made sure Marcus knew about each one. She would parade them through the palace and introduce them to visiting dignitaries, while Marcus stood in the background like a piece of furniture. "This is Lord Vex Arian," she would say with her arm wrapped around some handsome Celestine nobleman. "Is he not magnificent?" Then she would look at Marcus with cold amusement. "So much better than what the treaty forced upon me." The servants began to treat Marcus with open disrespect. They would accidentally spill things on him, or forget to bring his meals. They would speak about him in their own language, right in front of his face, thinking he could not understand. But Marcus was learning every night. After his duties were done, he would study the Celestine language and customs and history, learned their words and their ways, and soon he understood everything that was being said about him. But he kept this knowledge to himself. He also learned about the empire and its enemies and its weaknesses. He studied military reports that no one thought to hide from a mere human consort. He read about the ancient threats that had once nearly destroyed the Celestine people, and he waited one night. A young Celestine servant found Marcus alone in the palace gardens. She was one of the few who had never been cruel to him. "Why do you stay?" she asked with genuine confusion in her eyes. "They treat you so badly, and you just accept it." Marcus looked up at the unfamiliar stars and smiled softly. "I stay because my people need this alliance," he said. "Every insult I endure is a small price for keeping billions of humans safe." "But is that the only reason?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Patience is its own kind of strength," he finally said. The Empress sees my silence as weakness, but she is wrong. What do you mean? The servant asked. One day, Marcus said with quiet confidence. One day something will happen, and she will meet strength that she does not have, and when that day comes, I will still be here. The servant looked at him with new eyes. You are not what I expected, she said. No, Marcus agreed. I am not. He turned back to the stars, and the servant left him alone with his thoughts. The humiliation continued day after day and week after week. But Marcus' chum did not break. He bent like a tree in a storm, but his roots held firm and deep inside where no one could. See, a fire was growing, a fire that would one day light up the entire galaxy. The attack came without any warning on a morning that had started like every other. Morning Marcus was in his quarters reading reports when the alarms began to scream throughout the palace. Red lights flashed in every corridor and voices shouted orders in panicked tones. Marcus ran to the nearest window, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. The sky above the Celestine homeworld was filled with darkness. Not clouds and not night, but something else entirely. Ships. Thousands upon thousands of ships blocking out the light of the twin suns. They were black and twisted and wrong in ways that hurt the eyes to look at. Marcus had read about these ships in the old military histories. The Void Reapers had returned. Everyone had believed them destroyed 10,000 years ago, but they have been hiding in the empty spaces between galaxies, waiting and growing stronger now. They were back, and they wanted revenge. Marcus grabbed his uniform and ran toward the throne room. He had to know what was happening. The halls were chaos, with servants running in every direction and nobles shouting at each other in fear. No one paid any attention to the human consort as he pushed his way through the crowds. When he reached the throne room, the scene was even worse. Empress Zaravin sat on her throne with a face as pale as death. Her admirals and generals stood before her arguing and shouting, while holographic displays showed the terrible truth. 3 border worlds had already fallen. The Void Reapers did not conquer planets, they consumed them. Every living thing was taken and transformed into fuel for their endless hunger. Celestine fleet had engaged the enemy at the first border world, and the result had been disaster. Ships that had ruled the galaxy for 100,000 years were destroyed in minutes. Soldiers who had never known real war broke and ran at the first sight of the Reaper swarm. We must evacuate the core worlds, Admiral Corvin shouted with fear in his voice. It is our only chance. If we retreat, we lose everything. General Maltrix argued back. We must stand and fight. Fight with what? Another voice cried. Our fleet is scattered and our soldiers are terrified. The Empress watched them argue with empty eyes. For the first time in her eternal life, she faced an enemy that she could not defeat with words or threats or political games. The Void Reapers did not care about her power or her beauty or her ancient bloodline. They only wanted to consume your majesty. Admiral Corvin pleaded. We need a decision now. The Empress opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus had never seen her look so lost from his position at the back of the room, where consorts were expected to be silent and invisible. Marcus studied the tactical displays. He watched the patterns of the Reaper fleet, and he saw something that no one else seemed to notice. Something familiar. He had seen these patterns before in very old human military records. The Void Reapers were using swarm tactics that human armies had faced thousands of years ago. On Earth, different enemy but same strategy, and every strategy had a weakness. Marcus stepped forward, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. You are thinking about this. Wrong. Every head in the room turned to stare at him. Empress's eyes widened with shock and then narrowed with anger. What are you doing here? She demanded. This is a military council. I am a soldier, Your Majesty. Marcus replied calmly. I have been a soldier for 15 years, and I have fought in more battles than anyone in this room. Laughter erupted from the generals. A human soldier. General Maltrix sneered. What could you possibly know about warfare at this scale? Marcus ignored him and walked toward the tactical display. You have superior technology, he said, pointing at the enemy formations. But you are using inferior tactics. He manipulated the display to show the Reaper movement patterns. Look at how they move. He continued. They attack in swarms, and they overwhelm their targets with numbers, but they have no individual thinking. Every ship follows the commands of a central hive mind, he explained. Destroy the command ship, and the rest become confused and disorganized. Admiral Corvin frowned at the display. We have tried to identify their command ships, he said. They all look the same. No, they do not, Marcus replied. The command ships move differently, and here let me show you. He highlighted a specific vessel in the enemy formation. This one, he said. It stays in the center, and it never attacks directly, and all the other ships respond to its movements. The Admiral studied the display with growing interest. He might be right, Corvin admitted reluctantly. This is ridiculous. The Empress interrupted with a cold voice. We are not going to take military advice from a human pet. Marcus turned to face her directly. Your Majesty, he said without any fear in his voice. Your empire is dying while we stand here, arguing, and I am offering you a chance to save it. The throne room fell silent. No one had ever spoken to the Empress that way. Give me command of your reserve fleet, Marcus continued. 12 hours, and that is all I ask. And what will you do with 12 hours? The Empress asked with ice in her eyes. I will show you how humans fight, Marcus answered. I will show you why my species survived 1,000 wars on a single planet with nothing but sticks and stones. And if you fail, she asked. Marcus met her gaze without flinching. Then you will have lost nothing you were not already going to lose. The Empress stared at him for a long moment. The generals protested and the nobles complained, but she raised her hand for silence. You truly believe you can do this? She asked. I know I can, Marcus replied with absolute certainty. Something changed in the Empress's expression. For just a moment she looked at Marcus, as if seeing him for the first time. Very well, human, she said slowly. You have your 12 hours, and you have the reserve fleet. But know this, she added with deadly seriousness. If you fail, then the death of our empire will be on your hands. If I fail, Your Majesty, Marcus said with a slight bow, I will not be alive to carry that burden. He turned and walked out of the throne room behind him. He could hear the shocked whispers of the nobles and the angry protests of the generals. But he did not care about any of that. He had a war to win, and he had 12 hours to save a galaxy. Marcus smiled grimly as he walked toward the military command center. It was time to show these ancient beings what a human could do. It was time to fight. Marcus arrived at the military command center and found chaos waiting for him. Officers ran in every direction, and screens flashed with terrible images of destruction and death. When he announced that the Empress had given him command of the reserve fleet, no one believed him. This must be a joke, one captain said with a nervous laugh. Check with the palace if you want, Marcus replied coldly. But every second you waste is a second closer to our defeat. They checked, and when confirmation came back, the officers looked at Marcus with a mixture of fear and confusion. What are your orders? The captain asked reluctantly. Gather the reserve fleet at these coordinates, Marcus said, pointing to a spot on the star map, and prepare every fighter and every pilot for immediate deployment. But that location is near the dying star called Cortian. Another officer protested. The gravity wells there are extremely dangerous. I know, Marcus said with a grim smile. That is exactly why we are going there. The officers exchanged worried glances, but they followed his orders within 2 hours. The reserve fleet had assembled at the designated coordinates. It was not a large force compared to the enemy, only 300 ships against tens of thousands. But Marcus had a plan. He climbed into the cockpit of a small fighter craft, and the officers stared at him with shock. You cannot be serious. Admiral Corvin said through the communication screen. The commander does not fly at the front of the formation. This commander does. Marcus replied as he powered up his engines. He opened a channel to every ship in the fleet. All units listened carefully. He said in a calm and steady voice, "Forget everything you learned in your military academies and forget your formation training. Today you fight like humans." He divided the fleet into 20 small squadrons of 15 ships each squadron, had its own leader and its own target. We are not going to meet them head on, Marcus explained. We are going to hit them from every direction at once. Strike fast and then retreat and then strike again from somewhere else. He continued, never let them pin you down and never stop moving. But what about the command ship? A squadron leader asked. Leave that to me, Marcus said. The first wave of Void Reapers appeared on the edge of their sensors. Thousands of black ships moving like a cloud of hungry locusts. Remember, Marcus said one last time, do not be heroes, and do not try to fight them alone, and trust your squad mates, and trust the plan. For the Empire. Someone shouted over the comms. For the galaxy, Marcus corrected. Now go. The battle began. The Celestin ships darted in and out of the enemy formation like wasps attacking a bear. They would fire their weapons and then vanish before the Reapers could respond. The enemy swarm tried to chase them, but the Celestin ships were faster and more maneuverable, and every time the Reapers turned to pursue one squadron, another squadron would strike from behind. Marcus watched the battle unfold while flying his own ship through the chaos. He was not just watching, he was learning, studied how the enemy responded to each attack, and he saw patterns forming. The command ship was directing everything. When Marcus's squadrons attacked from the left, the command ship sent Reapers to the left. When they attacked from above, the command ship sent Reapers above. It was predictable, and predictable could be beaten. All squadrons, Marcus ordered, begin the spiral pattern now. The Celestin ships began to move in a complex dance. They circled around the Reaper fleet in an ever-tightening spiral. Each attack pushed the enemy closer and closer to the dying star. The gravity well began to pull at the Reaper ships, and their formations started to break apart. But the command ship stayed safe in the center, protected by thousands of loyal drones. Marcus had expected this. Squadron leaders, he said, on my signal you will execute the scatter pattern and draw as many Reapers as you can away from the center. What will you do? Someone asked. Something stupid, Marcus admitted with a small laugh. He pushed his fighter to maximum speed and headed straight for the heart of the enemy formation, human vessel. A terrible voice echoed through his communication system. You are outnumbered 10,000 to 1. It was the Reaper hive mind speaking directly to him. Turn back now, and your death will be quick. Marcus smiled as he armed his weapons. Then it is an even fight, he said. He flew into the swarm. Reaper ships tried to intercept him, but he dodged and weaved with skill that came from 15 years of combat experience. Laser blasts flew past his cockpit, and explosions lit up the darkness of space. But Marcus kept going. The command ship was directly ahead. It was larger than the others, and it pulsed with a sickly green light. Marcus armed his special payload, a weapon that the Celestin scientists had created, but never dared to use. A contained singularity bomb. If he could get it inside the command ship, the resulting black hole would tear the vessel apart from within. But there was almost no chance of surviving the blast. Marcus thought about his home and his family and everything he was leaving behind. Then he thought about the billions of lives he would save. Worth it, he said quietly. He flew straight into an opening in the command ship's hull and released the bomb. Then everything went white. Explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. The command ship was torn apart, and the singularity consumed everything around it. Without their leader, the Void Reapers fell into chaos. They crashed into each other and flew into the gravity well of the dying star. Within hours, the entire fleet was destroyed. The Celestin squadrons cheered and celebrated their impossible victory. But no one could find Marcus. His ship had been at the center of the explosion. There was no way anyone could have survived back. On the Celestine homeworld, Empress Zarvin watched the battle footage with tears streaming down her face. She had never cried before in her long life. "Find him," she commanded with a breaking voice. "Search every piece of debris and find him." Rescue ships flew to the battle site and searched for hours. Finally, deep in a field of wreckage, a faint signal was detected. Marcus's fighter had been thrown clear. By the explosion, the ship was destroyed, but the cockpit had somehow remained intact when the rescue team pulled Marcus from the wreckage. He was barely alive. His body was broken, and his breathing was shallow, but his heart still beat. The rescue team leader looked at the human with new respect. "Get him to the medical bay immediately," she ordered. "This man saved us all." Marcus woke 3 days later in a bed of soft light and healing energy. Every part of him hurt, but he was alive, and sitting beside him with red eyes and a weary face was Empress Zarvin. "You almost died," she said quietly. "I know," Marcus replied with a weak voice. "You nearly destroyed yourself for people who treated you like an animal," she continued. Marcus turned his head to look at her. "I did not do it for respect," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The Empress stared at him for a long moment. "I was wrong about you," she whispered. "I was wrong about everything." Marcus saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not contempt or amusement or cold superiority, but wonder and maybe, just maybe, something more. "Rest now," she said softly. "You have earned it." She reached out and gently touched his hand. For the first time since he arrived on this alien world, Marcus felt like he might actually belong. The Great Hall was filled with more beings than Marcus had ever seen in one place. Representatives from every world in the Celestine Dominion had come to witness this moment. Ambassadors from distant empires had traveled across the galaxy to be here, and the broadcast was being sent to the same 17 star systems that had watched Marcus be humiliated on his wedding day. But today, everything would be different. Marcus stood in a private chamber behind the main hall, dressed in clothes that actually fit him properly for the first time. These were not outdated servant garments, but the formal attire of a Celestine war hero, white and gold with silver medals on his chest that represented his victory over the Void Reapers. His servant entered and bowed. "Lo, the Empress requests your presence," she said with genuine respect in her voice. Marcus nodded and followed her to the entrance of the Great Hall. The doors opened, and he stepped inside. The crowd turned to look at him, and instead of whispers of contempt, he heard something else. Applause. It started slowly at first, with just a few hands clapping together, but it grew and grew until the entire hall was thundering with the sound. Marcus walked down the aisle with his head held high. He passed nobles who had once laughed at him, and now bowed. He passed generals who had mocked his humanity, and now they saluted. He reached the front of the hall, where a single figure waited for him. Empress Zarvin stood at the base of her throne, dressed in white and gold for the first time since their wedding. Her silver hair floated around her like a crown of light, and her eyes shone with an emotion that Marcus had never seen in them before. She stepped forward and took his hand in hers. Then she turned to face the assembled crowd and the billions watching across the galaxy. "I must make a confession," she announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall and beyond. "For months, I treated my consort with cruelty and contempt, and I did so publicly so that everyone could see my disdain." The hall was completely silent. "I called him primitive, and I called him weak, and I called him a pet," she continued. "I seated him with servants, and I mocked him at every opportunity." She paused and took a deep breath. "I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "When our empire faced its darkest hour, this human stepped forward," she said. "He asked for nothing but a chance to help, and I gave it to him expecting him to fail. Instead, he saved us all." She turned to look at Marcus with tears forming in her eyes. "I thought his silence was weakness, but it was discipline," she said. I thought his patience was submission, but it was wisdom. I thought his humanity made him lesser, but it was his humanity that gave him the courage to fly into certain death for people who had never shown him kindness. The Empress released his hand and walked to her throne. She reached up and removed a crown of stars from her head. This crown had been worn by every ruler of the Celestine Dominion for 100,000 years. It was the most sacred object in the Empire. She walked back to Marcus and placed the crown on his head. The crowd gasped. The Celestine Dominion has had empresses for millennia, she declared, but today, for the first time, we have an emperor. My equal in all things, she continued. My partner in all decisions. My husband in truth, and not just in name. The hall erupted in chaos. Some nobles shouted in protest at this break from tradition, but many more cheered and applauded. The common people who had gathered outside the palace began to chant his name. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. Through it all, Marcus stood quietly with the crown on his head. Then he reached up and removed it. The crowd fell silent again, wondering what he was doing. Marcus walked to the Empress and gently placed the crown back on her head. I do not need a crown, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. I never wanted power or titles or glory. Then what do you want? The Empress asked with confusion in her eyes. Marcus took her hands in his. I only ever wanted one thing, he said, to be seen for who I truly am. The Empress looked at him and finally truly saw him, not a human or a primitive or a treaty obligation, but a man of courage and honor and strength, a man who had endured humiliation without complaint, a man who had risked everything to save people who hated him, a man who asked for nothing in return but respect. Then let the galaxy see, she whispered. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was not a kiss of politics or obligation. It was a kiss of genuine feeling, of admiration that had grown into something deeper, of regret for time wasted on cruelty, of hope for a future built on respect and partnership. The broadcast captured everything. Across 17 star systems, billions of beings watched the Empress kiss her human consort. They saw the woman who had mocked him now looking at him with love in her eyes. They saw the man who had been treated as less than nothing now standing as her equal, and they understood that something had changed, not just in the Celestine Dominion, but in the entire galaxy. Humans were no longer a primitive species to be dismissed. They were allies to be respected. Marcus Chun had proven that with his own blood and courage. After the ceremony, the Empress walked with Marcus through the palace gardens, the same gardens where he had once sat alone looking up at unfamiliar stars. I have something for you, she said. She led him to a new wing of the palace. When the doors opened, Marcus saw a home, not a cold room in an abandoned corridor, but a real home, warm and bright with windows that looked out over the most beautiful views in the city. Your quarters, the Empress said, although I hope you will not spend much time here. Marcus looked at her with a question in his eyes. I hope you will spend your time with me, she explained with a shy smile that looked strange on her ancient face. In our quarters. Marcus felt something warm bloom in his chest. I would like that, he said. They stood together at the window and watched the twin suns set over the floating city. I am sorry, the Empress said quietly, for everything I did and for everything I said. I know, Marcus replied. How can you forgive me so easily? She asked. Marcus thought about the question for a long moment, because holding on to anger only hurts the person who holds it. He finally said, and because I believe people can change. Even ancient empresses, who should know better, she asked, especially them. Marcus said with a small smile. The Empress laughed, and it was not the cold, cruel laugh he had heard so many times before. It was warm and genuine and filled with joy. You're a strange creature, Marcus Chun, she said. Thank you, he replied. She looked at him with wonder in her eyes. What happens now? She asked. Marcus looked out at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Now we build something new, he said. Together. The Empress leaned her head against his shoulder. Together, she repeated, "I like the sound of that." And so the human groom who had been ridiculed and humiliated and treated as nothing stood beside the most powerful woman in 3 galaxies, not as a pet or a servant or a treaty obligation, but as a partner and an equal and a husband. The galaxy had witnessed his shame, and now the galaxy had witnessed his triumph. But Marcus did not care about what the galaxy thought. He only cared about the woman beside him and the future they would build, a future of respect and partnership, and maybe even love. The stars shone down on them as they stood together, 2 people from different worlds united at last and ready to face whatever came next, side by side.